Let's talk about feedback and how to give useful feedback and respond as a creator. I think in the hacking community, one of the most important things that doesn't get talked about enough is feedback and the importance of it. I think a lot of folks in the hacking community know that when projects get regular doses of feedback from the community or from playtesters, that they're more likely to improve and get better versus a hack that just drops complete with no playtesting that's kind of usually riddled with problems and unfairness. And so how we deliver the feedback is also really important, because feedback is also a way to sway a creator into making fixes or improvements. And I'll tell you what, as someone who has finished a hack, you get a lot of feedback. The moment I put complete on my thread title, man, dude, there were so many people who just wanted to share their thoughts and feelings. And some people are good at it and some people are bad at it. And when you're bad at giving feedback, it really hurts, because it can be incredibly demotivating if it's just coming off as you're frustrated or you're upset or you're just having a bad time and can't articulate how you feel. And it's hard for me as someone making something to action that when I basically just see whining. And so what we're going to talk about in this video is how do we give better feedback, but also for creators out there who are dealing with feedback on a regular basis, as they should be, how do you respond well and get the clarity you need to make choices in context? So let's get started. So what are our learning objectives today? Identify best practices for sharing and receiving feedback about your Fire Emblem game. We're going to talk about some good tips and tricks about receiving, giving feedback. I'll caveat this, like you might be asking, like, Pandan, why are you telling me how to give feedback? And I'll tell you why. I do this shit professionally. I spend a lot of my time giving and receiving feedback, and it's an art form. It's also a science, and it's something that you can learn and get better at over time. And usually the most successful people I work with are really good at both giving and handling feedback that they're given. And more often than not, it's those who we want to get feedback from are usually going to be in the positions where we value their opinion, right? Like, there are some folks who you want to get feedback from. It's probably because they're good at giving it. And you're going to take their opinion more seriously because they're good at giving it. And similarly, if you take feedback really well, I think folks will really appreciate that about you. So it's a good skill worth learning, not just for hacking, but just for life, just working in the professional world. So keep that in mind. Deliver helpful, constructive feedback to your fellow creators. So I'm hoping that after this video, the next hack you play, you're able to pop into their thread and say something constructive that'll help the creator understand what could be better and your recommendation. And then for creators, you'll be able to ask pointed follow-up questions to gain clarity. I would say the majority of this video is focused on being a feedback giver, because that's the majority of what we do. We're mostly giving feedback. Like, I'm going to probably play more hacks than I will have hacks created to receive feedback about. And there's probably more people here who play hacks than make hacks. So I'm going to focus on the giving of the feedback, because I think if you give really good feedback, it makes it a lot easier for the recipient to action it appropriately. So we'll talk about this just a bit. But first, let's level set here. What is feedback? The technical definition would tell you it is the transmission of evaluative or corrective information about an action, event, or process to the original or controlling source. Put another way, this is when you tell someone something about their thing. I'm going to tell, or actually, let's look at Grill, for example. Grill's going to tell Ike to, he's going to look at his stance and he's going to tell him to fix that. He's going to look at him and say, maybe stand up straight, maybe swing here, maybe step with your left foot first. I'm going to observe, and then I'm going to tell you what you could do better, give you some pointers to improve. and that's Grill transmitting that evaluative or corrective action to the original or controlling source, which in this example is Ike swinging his sword, and Grill's like, no, you can do it like this. Have you considered trying like this? I understand what you're going for, but consider this instead. This will help you for these reasons, X, Y, Z, etc. Feedback. You're giving someone advice based on something you've just observed about them. And being good at giving feedback is really important, because if you're bad at it, you're going to piss people off. So that's feedback. I do want to talk about one other thing before we get too deep into some examples, but I want to talk about motivations, because I think motivation is really important to understanding why and building empathy with the person you're giving feedback to. So this is a great book I read. I read this book when I was like 21. It's like just starting out my career. And I very fortunately ran into this book called Your Brain at Work by Dr. David Rock. And the thing with this book, and that it sticks with me to this day, and it's always one of the first books I recommend to people who are looking to just read good books about something that'll help them professionally, is this book talks about how we're motivated. And it also talks about how we respond to feedback and how to better give that feedback in relation to our motivations. And so in this book, Dr. Rock asserts that we as humans have 5 key motivations: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. That everything that we want to do is driven by one of these 5 desires. And we as humans are constantly on the spectrum that's guided by our emotions around what our most important motivations are that define what we do, how we say, how we give feedback, how we receive feedback. For example, I would probably consider myself, in general, a pretty high certainty and autonomy person, because I really value, having certainty in my life and knowing what's next. I value autonomy and that I can do things myself. I think that's important to me, and I'm going to do and say things that help me achieve these goals. I would say I'm a low status person because I don't really give a shit what people think about me, or achieving a certain rank. I am not motivated by that as much. And so knowing this about yourself is really important, but also being able to apply this to, how other people are thinking and responding. And this is really good when you're in a leadership position and you're trying to understand, why is someone acting the way that they're acting? Look at their motivations and how they're responding and what they're saying, and it's likely going to be related to one of these things. So it's important to consider what these motivations are and how we respond. What Dr. Rock asserts is we in our lives are faced with constant situations that we need to evaluate and respond to. It's just our lives. And when we're dealing with something, especially something that's unpleasant, we will typically have an emotional reaction to that. We are wired to respond emotionally to something. And that's why you'll very often see someone have an emotional outburst to something you might do or say, and then think about it, and then apologize. What Dr. Rock asserts in this book is that before you react rashly and let your emotional reaction be your guide, and having to backtrack from that, he says, think what your immediate response is going to be, analyze it briefly, label that emotion, because that helps you separate yourself from how you're feeling. You're able to analyze that thought, what's driving that thought, and then you're able to give a much more reasoned response, and that kind of keeps things on a more even keel, and also helps you give stuff that's going to be more evaluative to whoever it is you're giving feedback to. And so for myself, this is something I learned from this book and that I took to heart, because it's so important, right? Think of how often you might say something and then someone says something back to you that kind of hurts you, or it's dude, why'd you say it like that? Or man, you got really mad. And then they come back and apologize. But if you're able to very quickly recognize okay, I'm about to have an emotional response to something that just happened. Let me label that and understand why am I feeling this emotion, and let me give a more reasoned response around what it is that just happened, why it is making me feel the way I feel, and what I might do as a result, or the types of questions I might ask to better understand versus just having that emotional outburst. And part of that comes back to the motivations, where we want to understand the motivations of the stimulus that's making us feel this way, or our own motivations as we're labeling them. Like, for example, I got called in for work. Your boss calls you in for work tomorrow, and your emotional reaction might be, fuck, that was my day off. And instead of responding angrily to your boss, like, fine, I guess I'll go in, label that emotion. You wanted certainty, probably. You had the day off, and now your plans are changing. And when we have to change our plans, it's stressful. We're humans. We want certainty. We want that autonomy in our lives. And so, you think about a more reasoned response. It's a very quick example, but I'm illustrating all of this to talk about feedback because it's important to understand the motivations of the work that you're analyzing and the motivations of the creator. And while we might not necessarily use this framework to describe the motivations of a certain hack, understanding that hack creators will have a specific goal or a specific aim in what it is that they're doing is really important. And for us, as we respond to that, as we're giving them feedback, we might play their work, have an emotional response to a map or a character or something that's in the hack. And it's important for us to understand, like, why did it make us feel that way? And then provide a more reasoned response surrounding how we might mitigate it so that people don't feel that same emotion you just felt going forward. And this is like very baseline stuff, in my opinion. Like, this is like deep to the core, really understand why you feel how you feel, and then talk. And it takes time. And it took me many years to get good at this in my professional life, and it's helped me tremendously. And one thing that I think has always impressed people I've worked with is they're like, Dan, you have very good emotional control. And you're very good at receiving feedback. This is feedback I've received from my colleagues over the past decade since I've started working. And I owe a lot of credit to this book and how it helped me understand other people's motivations when they're giving me feedback. And it helps me provide more reasoned responses and separate myself from the work. And we can talk about stoicism another time, where stoic philosophy, like Seneca the Younger and Marcus Aurelius and all these other folks, with stoicism, there's a lot of emphasis on separating yourself from the thing that you're doing and focusing just on the thing and not staking your personal worth on the thing. I write a book, you give me feedback on the book, I need to separate myself from the book, and that your feedback is not an indictment of me, the creator of the book, but of the book itself. And now let me think about, all right, what can the book do to be better as a result versus I can't believe someone said this about me. So there's definitely some stoicism at play here, kind of the undertones for, I think, a lot of what Rock is saying. That's my interpretation, at least. I could be wrong, but definitely recommend looking to this book. Look into reading Stoic philosophy if emotional control is something you struggle with. I think just looking at feedback posts on Fire Emblem Universe, I think a lot of people struggle with this. It's hard, but I think if you can think through it and you have the tools to think through it, you're going to be much better equipped to handle giving feedback about Fire Emblem hacks and also in your life. So, and we've talked a lot about this, so let's keep moving. So when we talk about feedback in the Fire Emblem context, what does that mean? We can write a post. You show up in their Fire Emblem Universe thread, their Sarnas Forest thread, and you're like, hey, I played your hack. Overall, I liked it, and here's my long list of issues. I feel like I see that format a lot. But it was a really great hack, but here's my long list of issues. So, writing a post is pretty common. We're going to look at some examples through the lens of writing a post. What I like about writing a post as a feedback giver is it allows me to be really well manicured and precise on the key things I want someone to focus on, and it's generally going to be the fastest way for a recipient to download and pinpoint specific issues. Writing posts has a ton of value, and if you play something and if you have issues, tell the creator. Write a post. Don't just whine ad nauseum on Discord about how much the hack sucks. If I, as the creator, don't see that or don't know, how am I going to make it better? And you're just going to whine and be upset. Write a post. Write a well-reasoned post. We'll go through some examples. Some other feedback formats. Streaming. So, streaming is really key. I like streaming a lot. Video recording is not really very different. What I like about streaming for giving feedback is that you might have the creator in the room with you, being able to respond as you're playing something, and that can be really helpful for giving feedback in the moment. For me, there was a time in my life where I was launching an internal product to a team, and one of the things I would do to understand if the product was solving the need for the team was doing user testing. And I would watch someone, I would come up with a few prompts and I'd say, do this in the tool, do that in the tool. And I'd watch them do it, and I would look at their face to see how they were feeling, or if they were frustrated, was it clear, was it easy? And then also like hearing their feedback as they were going through and asking them like, how does this make you feel? Is this useful, etc. And it was a really good exercise for understanding where there were gaps and deficiencies that, for me as the person who made the thing, who knew it like the back of my hand, that I can do super easily. But was I communicating that clearly to the person using it? Are you as a hack creator communicating things clearly to a player in a way that's as easy as it is for you to understand as it is for them? So streaming can be really valuable for getting that live feedback. Video recording kind of does the same thing, albeit what I like about recording a bit more is that it's something that the recipient can take away and they can look at later. What I also like about video recording in the context of hack creation is that they don't necessarily have the hack creator to answer the questions for them. I see this a lot in like the playtesting channel in FAU, where I'll see the creator kind of like giving everyone like the tips, like keep this in mind, do this, do this, do this. And it's like, if you tell the player to do that, like maybe they'll understand in the moment and they'll miss that like it was actually really obtuse. And so having the video recording and having them kind of go off on their own, at least in our context as Fire Emblem hack creators, is going to be really helpful for the recipient. I like recording videos for that purpose, for giving feedback and not having the creator in the room, because the creator can kind of see like what solution I might try and come up with or how I struggle or figure it out. So there's some different formats. The one format I never recommend is whining on Discord. So, general tips for giving feedback. What should we consider when giving feedback? So we've talked a lot about motivations. We've talked a lot about like how you might provide that feedback. What are some tips? First, keep feedback in context. It's really important to understand what the author was going for when they created the thing. And it's important to understand the context of the work itself. For example, if I go into the Heroes We Deserve thread and I tell a reliable Characterization creator, I go, I think you should change the entire tone of the hack. I don't think it's funny, and I want you to make something more traditional. That feedback is useless because I completely ignore the context of what Chair is trying to achieve. Chair wants to do a parody. He wants to make something funny. And I'm not saying that the Heroes We Deserve isn't funny. I enjoy it a lot. But I'm using this to illustrate the example of like how outlandish some feedback you might receive is, and that if you're like basically telling them like make it exactly how I want, it's like that's not gonna be useful. You're like totally missing the point. You want to keep feedback in context. Like, okay, I see what you're trying to go for with this hack, but maybe you should consider that, you know, there might be a joke that is culturally insensitive, or there might be a joke that, you know, may not be culturally relevant and I didn't understand it, and maybe this could be an improvement because I understand what you're going for. And I think that's really important. It's something that I have to always remind myself, is that I know I have my own biases and preferences about Fire Emblem, and I might want things to be done a certain way all the time. And it's important that I keep those biases in check and remember what the creator is going for. The type of feedback I give the Heroes We Deserve versus the feedback I would give Deity Device versus the feedback I would give the Last Promise versus the feedback I would give the Road to Ruin, it's all going to be different because of the nature of the work and what it sets out to achieve. And so the context of my feedback needs to be different and why I'm making that recommendation needs to be different. And it's important that you think about, all right, the creator's not going to throw this whole thing out. Chair's not going to change the entire tone of his hack to make Chester a prince of some nation and, like, you know, every chapter's bandits chapter. He still wants to do the parody hack. How do I help him achieve the parody hack? How do I help him make it better in context? And that's kind of where you want to be in the space of when you're giving feedback. Really key. Like, when I get feedback saying, like, you know, Pandan, there's just too many units in Vision Quest. Take out the units. I don't want so many units. It's like, bro, I'm trying to make something Iron Man friendly. There's going to be a lot of units. So keep it in context, understand what they're trying to achieve, and we'll take her from there. I'm sorry, Chair. I didn't mean to throw you under the bus. I'm not saying your hack is anything culturally insensitive. I was just doing this for an example. Feedback should also be actionable. When I say actionable, I mean that if I hear something, I should be able to correct what it is I did. So for example, and we're going to look at this example a lot, when someone's like, hey, I played your hack and it was okay. Or I played your hack and it was bad and I didn't like it and it made me upset. And it's like, I hear that and it's like, all right, well, what can I do to fix that? Like, I'm sorry you had such a bad experience. What can I do? And they're like, well, it was bad. It was just bad. I'm like, that's not actionable. I can't do anything about it. Actionable feedback gives me something that I can do immediately as a result. Like, going back to our earlier example with Grail and Ike, Grail's going to tell Ike, hey, maybe stand up straight. Hey, fix your grip. There you go. You know, that is a little bit more actionable in the moment. In a Fire Emblem creation context, I might say something like, hey, I think if you move this enemy back one space, you'll be in a better spot. And even if it's vague, at least I have an understanding of what I can do to improve that. Similarly, feedback should be specific. Feedback needs to be really clear what you want to change or what your issue was, because my experience with that thing as the creator is going to be different than your experience as the player. And so you need to be really specific and provide something that's well reasoned to get through to the person who created it. I see this a lot where creators are really sticks in the mud about something, and they might rather tell you that you're wrong than, like, maybe admit that your feelings have some valid points, or that you might have something, you might be onto something. And so when you're really specific, it makes it a lot harder for someone to hand wave away your opinion, and a lot easier for them to say, oh, I understand now. I understand what you mean. And we'll talk about, like, specificity and its importance as we go through. And then lastly, separating that initial emotional response from your delivery. I love Fire Emblem, but it can certainly frustrate me to heck. And something that I have to do when I record, and it's one of the challenges of recording, especially when other people are watching, is that you want to separate your raw emotion from how you deliver feedback. And there are times where I am fuming, and I am mad, and I think the hack is being unfair. My fairness motivation is flaring up. I want the hack to be fair. And I'm upset. And I have to separate my emotional response of, fuck this hack, it's the crappiest hack I've ever played, from, like, you know, I really think this would be better without the ambush spawns. So, and here's why. Because it's unfair. You know, so separating that initial emotional response from your delivery, really, really key. It goes back to our motivations. Label them. Think about them. What would you do to prevent that from happening again to the next person? Empathy. So, let's do some examples. We're already 24 minutes in. I can ramble about this for a long time, lads. This is a doozy. We're going out on a high note. So Tate's going to walk us through some feedback examples. I am using the context of vanilla so that we all have a shared understanding, because we've all played the hell out of vanilla at this point. And so we're going to talk about some different vanilla games, and I'm going to walk through a couple different examples surrounding feedback around very common topics that I see feedback being delivered on, and how we can improve that. So first, we're going to talk about unit design. People love to talk about units. They love to give feedback about units. And so we're going to talk through something that's unhelpful, somewhat helpful, and very helpful to a creator. The unhelpful example is, Bartra is a bad unit. As a creator of FE7, this tells me nothing. Okay, I know the problem is Bartra, but I have no idea what the problem is. I've put Bartra in the game. I think he's great. He unlocks Carla. He's got funny book supports. How is he a bad unit? I don't understand. So you might come in and give me something more helpful. Bartra is a bad unit because his base speed is too low and you have better axe users. So this is a little bit more helpful because you're now providing reasoning why you think he's bad. Telling me he's bad on its own, it's like he could be bad for a million reasons and I might pick up the wrong one and not what you meant. If you're telling me his base speed is too low and that I have better axe users as a player, that gives me something to look at and compare against and think, okay, maybe he's onto something, but I'm still missing a little bit of specificity and action here for me to follow up on. The most helpful, and this is, you're gonna laugh because it's a big paragraph, this is highly helpful. Let's read it out loud. Bartra is a bad unit because his base speed is too low and you have better axe users. Because his base speed is 3, he can't double even the worst enemies and quickly risks getting double. It's specific. It's very specific. Hector and Marcus generally fill all of your axe needs as well, and he doesn't offer anything worthwhile to compete with him. I'd consider buffing his base speed and maybe tweaking his growths so that he can compete more with Hector as an infantry axe unit in the early game. That's actionable and specific. Now, think of the picture that this feedback person just painted for me as the creator. I'm Kohei Maeda, and I'm looking at this feedback on FE7, and that gives me an immediate understanding. Oh, this is the problem. He can't double these soldiers, and he gets outclassed by these other specific units. That's going to be so much more helpful for me as a creator than like where we started. He's bad. It's like, okay, he's bad, but like, why is he bad? What can we do to make him less bad? Really key. And I understand, like, you might be looking at this and be like, oh, it's so much to type out. It's like, dude, like, if you want something to be better, like, you got to put in the effort. Help the creator out because they might not realize that Bartra with 3 speed is a bad idea. And it's a bad idea because of the reasons that the highly helpful person laid out. So keep that in mind. So that's some unit design examples. Let's talk about map design. Map design. Talk about Fire Emblem 6, Chapter 8. The unhelpful feedback, which we see this all the time. Chapter 8 is bad. Alright, so I made Chapter 8. It's my first game without Kaga, and you're telling me Chapter 8 is bad? Why is it bad? I don't understand. Okay, I'm looking at Chapter 8. Somewhat helpful. Chapter 8 is bad because it's too big, and the units you get are pretty stinky. Alright, so that helps me understand that maybe there are certain aspects of the map that could use improvement. We're breaking it down. We've now identified that the map has some issues, and we've identified like high level what those issues are, but specifically I don't know how I'm supposed to remedy that or address it because you're not really telling me why it feels too big or why the units feel pretty stinky. It's like I might be looking at this the creator and be like, you know, Barth is not bad, like what's wrong with Barth? Or like, you know, OJ is gonna have the Western Isles next chapter, he's gonna have a lot of time to grind, and Wendy's like, you know, she's got pretty solid growths. Like I don't really get why you think they're stinky. That hurt. So let's talk about highly helpful. Chapter 8 is bad because it's too big and the units you get are not useful on join. So we're now breaking down, like when someone says pretty stinky, what they really mean is they're not useful on join. Think of that. That small change in how we describe something makes it so much more useful. Is Lena stinky or is she not useful on join? Or is she stinky because she's not useful on join? It's so important to break it down and make it really obvious and not rely on these terms that can be taken in hundreds of different directions. Be specific. It's not about whether it's bad or not. You might say like, here's my point, here's my second point, here's my third point, and that's why I think it's bad. That's fine. But like bad on its own or stinky on its own doesn't really tell me a whole lot. If you're telling me like the units are not useful on join, that makes things a lot more sense. That makes it a lot more sense for me because then I have something very specific to evaluate what you're saying against, and then I can make those micro corrections. Let's keep going. The linear path to the throne and the lack of enemy density makes it easy for my calves to push ahead and do all the work while my other units are constantly playing catch-up. Again, going back to the map is big. Here's why it feels big. I have to go down this one path, and it's not very dense. And that gives me a lot of space, and my other units fall behind. That paints a much clearer picture than like, the map is big. All right, the map's just big. Keep that in mind, specific. Additionally, the 3 units that join at the top right are also hard to use and don't help make the chapter easier. They're not useful on join. Let's talk about this a little more. How do they not make the chapter easier? I'd recommend reconfiguring the map to allow for multiple pathways, readjusting enemy placement so the player can use more than just their cavaliers, and adjusting the stats of the new units so they can contribute more immediately. I, as a creator, might still have some follow-ups to this, but at least we're having the right conversation. We're in the right ballpark, and we're talking about the things that can make this map better. And I'm curious for you, as someone reading this who's played FE6, like, yeah, like, those are probably the things I would want to fix too. For me as the FE6 creator, this is really helpful. I can go make a better ROM hack. This is great. Let's talk about balance. Talk about Fire Emblem 6 balance, because this is a common take. Fire Emblem 6 early game is miserable on hard. It's absolutely miserable. Your Jagan can't one-hit round KO in Chapter 7. God, that is miserable. Alright? It's miserable on hard. For me as the creator, what does that mean? Your hack is like maddening mode on hard. What does that mean? Oops, that wasn't supposed to show up both at once, but somewhat helpful feedback might be. The FE6 early game is miserable on hard because all of your units are bad and the hit rates are questionable. So again, you're starting to see the pattern here, I'm sure. This is a little bit more helpful because, okay, I know that they think it's miserable because they don't like the units and they don't like the hit rates, but saying they're bad, saying they're questionable, what does that really mean? I might have to go and parse that out, but what can we do to make that really clear? Highly helpful feedback. The Fire Emblem 6 early game is miserable on hard because of the unit quality and hit rates. Okay, so now we're talking about unit quality and just hit rates more broadly. Let's break this down. For example, we're getting some specificity here. Boars, your armor knight, has less HP than most units and can die in as many hits as non-armored units. Wolt's bases also make his chip unreliable and largely unhelpful because he is barely 3-hit KOing generics in Chapter 1. Also specific. I also don't know if this is true, but I was just writing it out as an example. Please don't hate me, FE6 fans. It's hard to get past the early part of the game without relying on some shaky hit rates to go your favor and complete all the anti-turtle objectives on time. Alright, so here they're saying the hit rates are shaky, which you might interpret as, okay, so like it's not necessarily reliable. They're in that range where you might miss frequently, which makes it hard to achieve the anti-turtle objective because there's a lot of coin flips. That helps me out a lot as a creator. I recommend buffing the player units across the board and increasing hit rates so they're more reliable early on. I think to take this example a step further, you might go like a very specific recommendation around increasing hit rates, saying like just buff weapon hit a bit. Maybe add like 5 or 10 hit to each weapon, and that's going to bring you to a new place. Stuff like that's really helpful. Like, how do you achieve these things? All right, you want better units, you want better hit rates. How do I go about making that better, in your opinion, based on what I've tried to achieve? And then we have something to discuss. So now we're going to talk about lack of clarity or fairness. We're going to give FE6 a break because we've been riffing on it for a little bit now. And this speaks a lot to our desire for fairness and our desire for certainty in our lives. And so we're going to talk about Chapter 13 of Fire Emblem Three Houses, which is the first time skip map with lovely Pyardo and his great haircut. Chapter 13 is unfair. Okay, so now I understand it's unfair. What does that mean? Somewhat helpful might be Chapter 13 is unfair because it hides information from the player and you can soft lock. Okay, so me as the creator, I am Sakihara. I'm hiding information from the player and I've made it potential for a player to soft lock. I don't know how, but I'm kind of like looking in this direction, trying to figure it out based on what you've said. But what's most helpful here? God, I wrote so much for this. Chapter 13 is bad because it hides information from the player and you can soft lock. For example, being specific. I don't know when and where each group of units will spawn in, so I have to abuse Divine Pulse to deal with units spawning into weak places or getting hit with an ambush. Right? So here we're saying two very specific things. because I don't know where my players are spawning in, I'm kind of leaving things to chance because I don't have any strategic control over where my units are being placed, and I can get screwed by it. That's unfair. I didn't do anything wrong. The game is doing something wrong to me. This person keeps going. Additionally, it's easy to soft lock because of the assumed strength of these units. I bench this group of units that spawn on the top left, and they die almost immediately because the units I did use don't spawn in because they weren't in-house units. So this is very specific. Again, this person is saying, you basically put me in a situation where I don't have control over who is spawning in and when, and the units I did train aren't showing up on this map, and so I'm in a bad spot. Maybe consider adding preps or providing more leeway for the player to beat the map, assuming their units are worse. And that's the specific and actionable thing that you can do. The thing that they can action to address these concerns around unfairness that you've laid out. These very specific concerns, right? So they're being specific about the units being weak and spawning into a place where they can get ambushed. It's very specific feedback, and now you're actioning it. This is what I would do. Maybe add preps. Add more leeway for the player to beat the map, assuming their units are worse, which you could also interpret as make the enemies a little bit weaker so that the player can handle them if they're not as well equipped. This is common stuff. But if you've played this map, you would understand. You might agree. I'm like, yeah, this is probably the way I would want to fix it too. But isn't that much more helpful than Chapter 13 is unfair? All right? Be specific. Like, you're posting in this dude's thread who doesn't know you. Give them specific things. Make it actionable. All right, and now last example. Writing and characterization. So this one's definitely a lot more subjective. And we're going to make fun of Ephraim a bit here because I've seen this feedback a bunch when people get mad about Ephraim's character. But we're going to talk about writing and characterization and how we give feedback there. And this one, I would argue, is probably one of the most delicate because, you know, this is probably the most artsy of the feedback and the least sciencey. Like, the other parts you can, like, chalk up. It's like, this is just your gameplay, dude. But this is actually about, like, the art of the hack. And this one's really unhelpful. Ephraim is a Gary stew. First off, why? Secondly, what the heck is a Gary stew? I had to ask some folks in my Discord, like, do people say Gary stew still? Do they still say that? What does this really even mean? I just hear it around a lot, but I don't know what it means. It's not specific. This is somewhat helpful. Ephraim is a Gary stew. He faces tough odds and always wins, nor does he seem to grow from it. Alright, so we're looking at different aspects of his character. You're giving me some understanding of why you might think he is a, quote, Gary stew. I don't really understand this term. I actually really don't understand this term. But you're giving me some direction to go, and you're getting a little bit more specific. Now, let's be highly helpful here. You're trying to help the Fire Emblem 8 devs make a more compelling lord. And in this example, they don't even use the term Gary stew. This term that can be charged with mixed emotions that might mean things to different people. It's not specific. It's too vague. A highly helpful example. Ephraim doesn't learn that much throughout the story. The plot seems to go out of its way to make it easy for him to win. For example, in Chapter 5X, getting specific, he takes on a fort with 3 units, gets captured, and escapes, and doesn't seem to ever really reflect on the experience or talk about how lucky he was. Okay, that's fair. He doesn't do that. At least I don't think he does. It's been a while since I played vanilla, so please correct me if I'm wrong. If you want Ephraim to appear more real, right? So this is the feedback creator looking into the brain of FE8 creator and thinking, your goal is to make Ephraim relatable. So let's talk about making him feel more real. This is what I would do. It may be beneficial to add a scene where he confides in someone that he was frightened or may be less inclined to take such a risky gambit in the future. It's a very specific recommendation to address a very specific issue that causes Ephraim to read a certain way. And when you get to this level of specificity, you're able to have a much more productive conversation with the creator. You're able to be constructive, right? When we talk about constructive feedback, we're building. This type of comment, you're helping the creator build something that's better versus like, he's just a Gary stew. You're just insulting Ephraim. It's Gary stew. Just hand wave it up. Gary stew. Gary stew. So think about how much more helpful this kind of example is. And I'm curious, like, I mean, even you and I, as people who didn't make the sack, like, we could have debates around this very specific thing and come up with something actionable out of it. Like, do we think that this would help make Ephraim feel more relatable? Is that really the core of the issue here? Right? Let's think about that. So those are some examples. But we have to talk about taking feedback and how we respond softly with grace. You see what I did there? Linus does. That's why he's smirking. But general tips for taking feedback. So we've spent most of our time talking about the giving of the feedback. Feedback is a gift. You often give it. But we also have to receive feedback. And how we handle feedback is really clear because that's going to signal to other folks, are we going to be, quote, easy to work with? And are we going to actually listen to what people are going to say? Like, people are going to be more inclined to give you more actionable and specific feedback and take the time to give you something meaningful if they like what you've done. Like, I think this kind of goes back to, like, that idea of, I'd rather be hated than ignored. Like, indifference is the worst. Like, if someone's like, I don't really care about you, I don't really care about this hack, I don't really care about that, like, that's worse than someone actively being annoyed by it. Because if they're actively annoyed, they cared, and they're going to try and make you understand how they feel. Versus like, I don't even want to try it. Because, the creator doesn't take feedback well. I'm not even going to bother trying to help this person make it better. Like, that's bad. That's a bad situation to be in. So taking feedback well is important. What can we do about taking feedback? Ask probing questions for additional clarity. How? Why? What would help improve X? Could you explain more in detail? I like to do this a lot. I like to follow up with some feedback to get even more specificity out of someone. And so if someone's like, hey, this unit's not that great, I think they kind of stink in this chapter, it's like, well, what do you mean by that? Can you be a little bit more specific? Getting additional clarity is really helpful as a creator to really pinpoint what their issue is so you can remedy their overarching issue of unit bad from the lens of that very specific issue. Molder's a bad unit. Well, why is he a bad unit? Well, in the join chapter, he gets doubled. Okay, well, maybe I buff up his speed a little bit so he doesn't get doubled. Now he might be a little bit less bad. I know that doesn't actually happen, but bear with me. Second, provide additional context surrounding your choice. So sometimes people might misunderstand what it is that you're going for. And it's important for them to understand the context surrounding your choice. Like, hey, one thing I would recommend you do in Vision Quest is add more starting events with units moving on the map. And I might say to you, well, this is the reason why I didn't do that. And why I won't do that. Because I think it's really time consuming and I'd rather spend my time doing other things. And I don't think it adds a lot personally. Similarly, you might ask like, hey, between these two units, one unit is distinctly better than the other. Can you make the other unit better? It's like, well, when we say that other unit, what do we need to do to make them better? And I would say, maybe this other unit is meant to be a little bit stronger because of the lore, the backstory, or because of the time they join and the different thresholds or whatever. Or maybe highlighting, like, actually recognize that the earlier unit, you might have just had bad luck. On average, their performance is going to be X, Y, or Z. But what can we do to fix that? Providing the context, right, is really helpful to make people understand your viewpoint and why you might have done something. And I've actually had some really productive conversations when I bring in a lot of context to what I've done. Especially like around like, why does Vision Quest have so many units? Why are the maps so small? Let's talk about that. This is my context. And then bring it back to your main objective and goal, right? Like, why are we here? What are we doing? My goal is to make this kind of hack have this kind of feeling. For me, it's like, let's make it Iron Man friendly. That's my overarching goal, and I'm going to do these specific things to achieve that goal. So when you tell me there's too many units, I might say, well, I want to make it Iron Man friendly. That's my main objective and goal. To achieve that, one of the angles I took was to give the player a lot of units. What this then means is that I made sacrifices in other areas that you're not happy about. Maybe there's less characterization than you want. Maybe you feel like some characters don't get enough screen time. Well, I was trying to do this. And that might make someone say, okay, like I understand like why for this goal. That makes sense. I was looking at it differently because my main objective and goal and what I like the most is different. That goes back to like giving feedback and context, understanding your context. And then lastly, as a creator, propose a solution I think this is always really key, because sometimes people who give feedback, they want to feel heard. And they want to feel like what they're saying is going to make an impact. And I might not always want to take what someone says wholesale. I might say, okay, like, how about you're telling me to buff Lara by like 5 speed? I might say, okay, maybe instead of buffing her by 5 speed, we give her a tome that she can use temporarily that helps her deal with these certain deficiencies that you've called out. And that I think will be a little bit more fair in context. And that person might say, yeah, that makes sense. Right? Like, propose a solution. Highlight like what you're going to do about it. Because if you're just like, okay, thanks. I was like, what are you going to listen to me? Are you going to do anything about it? Propose a solution. Like, what are you going to do based on the feedback? I think that's really key. So that's it. Overall, guys, I want everyone to be thoughtful and constructive. Be actionable, be specific. Label your emotions and give better feedback. I think if we as hacking community are better about giving and receiving feedback about each other's work, that the quality of our projects and also just the quality of our discourse on hacking is going to be so much better. It is so much better. We have so much potential to make it better. I want it to be better. So keep these things in mind, and as you're thinking of feedback, think about these things. There's so many other topics that we can talk about with, like, you know, and this kind of gets more into the realm of like performance management that we didn't really get into, but like, you know, how are we evaluating things and like on what dimensions and like how do we articulate those things? Like, that's another topic, that's another video. But I think feedback is really important to get right. It's something we're constantly doing. And if we can get good at giving feedback to each other, I think that we can make some really killer shit. So I'm hoping that you, as the viewer, will take my feedback about feedback and consider these tips and tricks when delivering feedback to your next project, because it's going to make a world of difference. If everyone's giving you well-reasoned feedback that is in context of what the creator is going for, we're going to have some good discussion. We're going to make some good hacks. But it's also up to you as a creator to be receptive of that and recognize, like, you know, maybe my shit does stink sometimes and I should ask some probing questions to understand why someone's having an issue. And also, if, like, you know, knowing who's giving you feedback is really important. We didn't really talk too much about that. But it's important to remember, like, hey, if like 5 people are coming to you and having the same exact issue, but you don't see it as an issue, the issue is probably you. So keep that in mind too. Like, we are not perfect as creators. We will make mistakes and we'll do things that piss people off. And it's important to figure out, like, hey, if people are complaining about this, are they just not getting it, or is it something that I can fix? And usually it's something that you can fix. Sometimes it's things that they don't get. But you gotta keep that in mind. And again, it's important to educate as well when you're receiving feedback and providing more context. Well, this is what I meant by doing this. And then the person giving feedback might say, well, actually, let's make that clearer then. Let's make that clear. Your explanation, that's what I needed. So I would love to get your feedback on this video. I think this is going to be one of the last videos I do on this topic. But I think it's super important. I'm very passionate about feedback. I think it's important to get right. And I hope that it's helpful to you. And without any further ado, we've been going for almost 50 minutes. I'm going to call it here. Thank you all for watching my video on feedback. I hope to hear your feedback and whether you liked it. I hope your feedback is actionable and specific. Do know, though, that I'm not going to make any edits to this video. But feel free to add to the discussion and share your thoughts. See, I'm being upfront. Your feedback, you know, it's great, but I'm not going to do anything about it right now on this video. But share it so that others may learn. And I'd love to hear other people's thoughts and feelings on feedback in general. Your feedback on feedback is really key to making everything work. So remember these things when you're giving feedback and receiving feedback. Until next time, guys, be safe out there, and I'll see you later. Great timing.